The banquet hall of Harmony's Rest glowed with the light of 1,000 floating crystals, and the air hummed with conversations in dozens of alien languages that mixed together like music from distant worlds. Ambassador Kang Do-yoon stepped through the grand entrance and paused for just a moment to take in the scene before him, adjusting the collar of his formal diplomatic uniform. As he did so, he was not a tall man, and his hair had turned gray at the temples over the years of service to Earth's diplomatic corps. But his eyes remained sharp and watchful as they scanned the crowd of alien dignitaries. Tonight marked the 10th anniversary of the Galactic Compact, and representatives from over 40 species had gathered on this neutral station to celebrate a decade of fragile peace among the stars. Do-yoon had attended many such events during his career, and he knew how to move through a room without drawing attention to himself, greeting those who approached him with quiet courtesy while never seeking the spotlight. He preferred it that way, and he had built his reputation on being reliable rather than remarkable. A man who solved problems through patience rather than grand gestures. The Valori delegation caught his eye as he moved deeper into the hall, their iridescent feathers shimmering under the crystal lights in shades of blue and violet that shifted with every movement. They were an elegant species, tall and graceful, with large expressive eyes and voices that carried a natural melody even when speaking. The common trade language Do-yoon had worked with the Valori before and knew them to be proud beings with memories that stretched across generations. Never forgetting a kindness or an insult, he planned to pay his respects to their high matriarch later in the evening. But for now, he simply wanted to find a quiet corner and observe the political currents flowing through the room. That plan ended the moment he heard the Gasped. Young Valori woman stood frozen near the center of the hall, her feathers rippling with an emotion that Do-yoon could not immediately read, and her large golden eyes were fixed directly on him. She clutched the arm of an older Valori female whose elaborate plumage marked her as someone of great importance, and her voice carried across the sudden silence that had fallen around them. The young woman breathed, and her voice trembled with something that sounded almost like awe. "It's him." Do-yoon stopped walking and felt a cold sensation spread through his chest as recognition began to dawn in his mind. "The human who protected me," the young Valori continued. And now others were turning to look, curious about the scene unfolding before them. The older Valori turned slowly, and Do-yoon found himself meeting the piercing gaze of High Matriarch Valensa herself, one of the most powerful figures in the Valori government. Her eyes narrowed as she studied him, taking in every detail of his weathered face and the way his hand had instinctively moved toward a scar hidden beneath his uniform. "Ambassador Kang Do-yoon of Earth," Valensa said, and her melodic voice cut through the murmurs around them like a blade through silk. "My daughter Azara seems to believe she knows you." Do-yoon's throat felt dry, and memories he had buried for 10 long years came rushing back like a flood breaking through a dam. He saw smoke and fire, heard screaming and weapons fire, felt the weight of a small feathered body pressed against his chest as he ran through corridors filled with chaos. "High Matriarch," he said carefully, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I am honored to meet you and your daughter." Azara stepped forward, and Do-yoon could see the fledgling she had once been reflected in her adult features. Those same golden eyes that had looked up at him with terror and desperate hope on the worst day of both their lives. "You remember," she said softly. "I can see it in your face." The crowd had grown quiet now, sensing that something significant was happening, and Do-yoon could feel the weight of countless alien eyes upon him. He wanted to deflect, to change the subject, to slip away into the anonymity he had cultivated for so many years. But looking at Azara now, seeing the young woman she had become, he found that he could not deny the truth. "Outpost Karen," he said quietly, and the name hung in the air between them like a ghost, finally given voice. Valence's expression shifted, and her feathers rose slightly in what Do-hyun recognized as surprise mixed with something deeper. "You were there," she said. "And it was not a question. You were the one who sent the message, who kept my daughter alive when everyone else had given up hope." The banquet hall had fallen completely silent now, and Do-hyun became aware that this moment was no longer private, that whatever he said next would echo through diplomatic channels across the galaxy. He took a slow breath and met Valence's gaze without flinching. "I did what anyone should have done," he said simply. "She was a child in danger, and I was there." Asara shook her head, and tears glistened in her golden eyes. "You did far more than that," she whispered. "And I have spent 10 years searching for you, hoping to find the human who stood between me and death when he had every reason to run." Valence stepped closer to Do-hyun, and her presence seemed to fill the space around them with an ancient authority that made even the other diplomats step back. "I think, Ambassador," she said slowly, "that you have a story to tell, and I think it is time the galaxy heard it." Do-hyun looked at the High Matriarch, then at her daughter, and finally at the crowd of alien faces watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion to something almost like hope. The past he had tried so hard to leave behind had finally caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to hide. 10 years earlier, Outpost Karen had been nothing special. Just another refueling station on the edge of contested space, where traders and travelers stopped to rest before continuing their journeys into the unknown. Kang Do-hyun had been younger then, a low-ranking trade attaché assigned to negotiate fuel prices and cargo agreements. The kind of boring work that nobody noticed and nobody celebrated. He had been reviewing documents in the civilian lounge when the first explosion rocked the station and threw him from his chair. Alarms screamed through the corridors as smoke began to fill the air, and Do-hyun heard the unmistakable sound of weapons fire echoing from the docking bays. "Pirates!" someone shouted, and panic spread through the lounge like wildfire. Through dry grass, Do-hyun grabbed a young human technician and pulled her behind an overturned table as another explosion shook the walls around them. "Stay low," he ordered, his mind racing through everything he knew about station layouts and emergency protocols. "The security teams will handle this." But even as he spoke the words, he saw the security feeds flickering on the lounge screens, showing armored figures cutting through the station's defenders like they were nothing more than obstacles to be removed. The Drexari Syndicate had come to Outpost Karen, and they had come prepared for a fight within an hour. The shooting had stopped, and the pirates had begun gathering hostages in the main cargo hold. Separating them by species and apparent value, Do-hyun kept his head down and tried to blend into the crowd of terrified civilians, knowing that drawing attention to himself would only make things worse. That was when he heard the crying of a small Valori fledgling huddled in the corner of the corridor, her tiny feathers matted with dust and her golden eyes wide with terror as she called out for her mother in a language Do-hyun did not speak. Near her lay an adult Valori female, unconscious and bleeding from a wound on her head, struck down during the initial assault and left for dead by the pirates who had swept through. Do-hyun looked around and saw that no one else had noticed the child, that everyone was too focused on their own survival to spare a thought for a small alien girl alone and afraid. He should have kept walking and should have focused on his own safety like everyone else instead. He moved toward her. "Hey," he said softly, kneeling down and keeping his movement slow and gentle. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The fledgling looked up at him with those enormous golden eyes, and Do-hyun felt something twist in his chest at the raw fear he saw there. "Your mother is hurt, but she's alive," he continued, checking the adult Valori's pulse and finding it steady despite the injury. "I'm going to help you, all right." He did not know if she understood his words, but she seemed to understand his tone. and when he reached out his hand, she took it with her small feathered fingers and held on tight. The next 6 hours became a blur of terror and determination that Doheen would never fully be able to forget. The pirates separated the hostages by species, and when they came for the alien children, declaring them low value and suitable only for sale to the slave markets of the outer systems, Doheen made a choice that would change his life forever. "She's with me," he said, stepping in front of the fledgling as a scarred Dressari pirate reached for her. "Earth isn't interested in this one," the pirate laughed, a harsh and ugly sound that echoed through the cargo hold. "A human protecting alien spawn," he sneered. "What game are you playing?" "Diblama." Doheen straightened his spine and met the pirate's eyes without flinching. "No game," he said coldly. "This child is under Earth's protection, and if anything happens to her, I will make sure that every human ship in this sector knows your face and your name." It was a bluff, a desperate gamble by a man with no weapons and no power. But Doheen delivered it with the calm certainty of someone who held all the cards. The pirate hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Doheen saw his chance. "Think about it," he continued. "Is one small fledgling worth bringing the wrath of Earth down on your syndicate?" The Drexary's eyes narrowed, but he lowered his hand and moved on to easier targets, leaving Doheen standing over the trembling child with his heart pounding in his chest. But the danger was far from over for 6 hours. Doheen stayed by the fledgling's side, shielding her from the pirates, who grew more frustrated as time passed and their demands went unanswered. When one pirate, drunk on stolen spirits and angry at the lack of ransom payments, decided to make an example of the worthless alien child, Doheen put himself between them without a moment's hesitation. The blade caught him across the shoulder, cutting deep into muscle and sending blood spattering across the metal floor. Doheen did not cry out, did not fall, did not step aside. He simply stood there, his blood dripping onto the deck, and stared at the pirate with eyes that held no fear, only an absolute refusal to move. "You'll have to kill me first," he said quietly. The pirate raised his blade again, and Doheen prepared to die for a child whose name he did not even know. Then the rescue ships arrived. The sound of weapons fire erupted from the docking bays, and the pirates scattered to defend their stolen prize, leaving Doheen slumped against the wall with the fledgling still clutching his hand. When the soldiers finally reached the cargo hold, they found a human diplomat bleeding from a shoulder wound, shielding an unconscious Valori mother and her terrified daughter with nothing but his own body. The fledgling would not let go of his hand, not even when the medics tried to treat his wound. "It's okay," Doheen whispered to her as his vision began to blur from blood loss. "You're safe now." Those were the last words he spoke before he passed out. And when he woke up 3 days later in a hospital bed, the Valori mother and daughter were gone. He never tried to find them, never spoke of what had happened, never claimed any recognition for what he had done. Some things, he believed, were not meant to be celebrated. They were simply meant to be done. The banquet hall had transformed from a celebration into something closer to a trial, and Kang Do-hyun found himself at the center of attention. He had spent a decade avoiding. Matriarch Valenza stood before him with her feathers raised in an expression that mixed respect with something that might have been accusation. 10 years, she said, her melodic voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. For 10 years, I have searched for the human who saved my daughter. And for 10 years you have hidden yourself from recognition. Do-hyun kept his expression neutral, even as he felt the weight of countless eyes pressing down upon him. I did not hide, High Matriarch, he said quietly. I simply did not seek attention for doing what was right. What was right? Valenza repeated, and something in her tone sharpened like a blade being drawn. You bled for my child. You stood against armed criminals with nothing but words and your own body. And you call this simply doing what was right? Isara stepped forward then, And Do-yoon saw tears glistening in her golden eyes as she looked at him with an intensity that made his chest ache. "I remember everything," she said, her voice steady despite her emotion. "I was young, but I remember." The crowd leaned in, drawn by the raw honesty in her words. "I remember the smoke and the fire," Isara continued. "I remember my mother falling and not getting up. And I remember the fear that swallowed everything until I could not breathe." She paused and took a shaky breath before continuing. "Then he came," she said, nodding toward Do-yoon, this human I had never met, speaking words I did not understand, but with a voice so calm and gentle that I knew I could trust him. Do-yoon closed his eyes for just a moment, and the memories washed over him once more. "He stayed with me when everyone else ran," Isara said. "He held my hand when the pirates came, and when they tried to take me away, he stepped between us and refused to move." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Do-yoon saw expressions shifting from curiosity to something approaching awe. "I remembered the blood," Isara whispered. "I remember watching him take a blade that was meant for me, watching his blood fall onto the floor. And still he did not move." She turned to face the assembled dignitaries, her feathers rising with passionate conviction. "He was not a soldier," she declared. "He was not armed. He was not trained for combat. But he stood against armed killers and dared them to go through him to reach me." Valenza placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, then turned her sharp gaze back to Do-hyun. "Why?" she demanded. "Why did you never come forward? Never claim the debt we owed you? Never seek the reward that was rightfully yours?" The room fell silent again. Waiting for his answer, Do-hyun let out a slow breath and met Valenza's eyes with a calmness born of absolute certainty. "She was a child," he said simply. "That's all that mattered." The high matriarch stared at him for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "Among my people, such an act creates a life debt that spans generations," she said. "You saved my daughter's life at the risk of your own, asking nothing in return. And now you stand before me claiming it was nothing." "I didn't say it was nothing," Do-hyun replied gently. "I said it was what anyone should have done." A harsh laugh cut through the emotional atmosphere, and Do-hyun turned to see a Karath general pushing forward through the crowd. His scaled face twisted with skepticism. "One human, one child," the general scoffed. "This is the great deed we are meant to celebrate. A single act of foolish heroism that changes nothing." Valenza's feathers rose sharply, and her eyes turned cold as ice as she faced the Korath. "You missed the point entirely," she said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "It is precisely because he asked for nothing that this matters." The general opened his mouth to respond, but Valenza continued without giving him the chance. "We have all seen human soldiers fight," she declared. "We have all heard stories of their resilience, their stubbornness, their refusal to surrender, even when faced with impossible odds." She gestured toward Do-hyun with an elegant sweep of her wing. "But this man was not a soldier," she continued. "He was a diplomat, a bureaucrat, a man of papers and negotiations who had no training for combat and no reason to risk his life." The crowd murmured in agreement, and even the Karath general seemed to lose some of his certainty. "He could have hidden," Valenza said. "He could have focused on his own survival like so many others did that day. But when he saw a child in danger, a child not of his species, not of his world, not connected to him in any way, he chose to stand between her and death." She turned back to face Do-hyun, and her expression had transformed into something that looked almost like reverence. "He expected to die," she said quietly. "I have studied the records, the security footage, the testimony of other survivors, and I know what he was facing." Do-hyun said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. "He expected to die," Valenza repeated. "And he stood there anyway, bleeding and unarmed, refusing to move, because a child he had never met was hiding behind him. The High Matriarch spread her wings in a gesture that Do-hyun recognized as the highest form of Valori respect. "This is what humanity means," she declared to the assembled dignitaries. "Not their warships, not their weapons, not their technology, but this willingness to sacrifice everything for those who cannot protect themselves." The room erupted in whispered conversations as representatives from dozens of species turned to one another, sharing their reactions to what they had witnessed. Do-hyun stood alone in the center of it all, wishing he could disappear. Knowing that the quiet anonymity he had treasured was gone forever, Isara approached him once more and took his hand in hers, just as she had done 10 years ago on the blood-stained floor of Outpost Karan. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me the chance to grow up, to become who I am today." Do-hyun looked at the young woman before him, at the diplomat and peacemaker she had become, and felt something warm spread through his chest. Perhaps, he thought, some sacrifices were worth remembering after all. Word of what had happened at the banquet spread through the diplomatic community like fire through dry grass, and by the next morning, Kang Do-hyun found himself at the center of a debate he had never wanted to join. The story of Outpost Karen had become more than just a tale of one man's courage. It had become a symbol, a test case for how the galaxy should view humanity as a wholesome species, saw it as proof that humans could be trusted, that beneath their warlike reputation lay a capacity for compassion that made them worthy allies. Others viewed it with suspicion, wondering if this sudden revelation was merely clever propaganda designed to soften the galaxy's resistance to human expansion. The Galactic Compact's emergency session convened in the Great Chamber of Harmony's Rest, and representatives from 47 species took their seats to discuss what many were calling the most important question of the decade: should humanity be granted a permanent seat on the Galactic Council? Do-hyun sat in the observer's gallery, watching the proceedings with growing unease as politicians and diplomats debated his actions like they were pieces on a game board. "The humans are conquerors wearing friendly faces," declared the Korath ambassador, his scaled fist pounding the podium. "One act of kindness does not erase centuries of violence on their homeworld, and yet that one act saved a life," responded the Valori delegate. While the Korath Empire has never once intervened to protect civilians of other species during their many conflicts, the chamber erupted in shouting and accusations, and Do-hyun felt a headache building behind his eyes. This was not what he had wanted, not what he had ever imagined when he had stepped between a pirate's blade and a frightened child. A hand touched his shoulder, and he turned to find Isara standing beside him with a gentle expression on her face. "They want you to speak," she said quietly. "The Valori delegation has requested that you address the assembly." Do-hyun's heart sank, and he shook his head slowly. "I'm not a speaker," he said. "I'm not a hero or a symbol. I'm just a man who did what needed to be done." "That is exactly why you should speak," Isara replied, "because they need to see that. They need to understand that humanity's greatest strength is not found in soldiers or warships." Do-hyun looked out at the chamber, where delegates continued to argue, their voices rising and falling like waves in a storm. He thought about all the years he had spent avoiding this moment, hiding behind paperwork and protocol, pretending that the past could simply be forgotten. Then he thought about the fledgling who had clutched his hand in the darkness, trusting him to keep her safe when everything else had fallen apart. "All right," he said finally. "I'll speak." The chamber fell silent as Do-hyun walked to the central podium, and he could feel the weight of countless alien eyes pressing down upon him like a physical force. Gripped the edges of the podium and took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I am not here to tell you that humanity is perfect," he began, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "We are not, and we have never claimed to be. The delegates watched him with expressions ranging from skepticism to curiosity. "We are a young species by galactic standards," Do-Yun continued, "and we have made countless mistakes on our path to the stars. Mistakes that have cost lives, destroyed worlds, and brought shame upon our name." A murmur rippled through the chamber, and Do-Hyun saw the Karth ambassador leaning forward with a satisfied expression. "But we learn," Do-Hyun said, and his voice grew stronger. "We learn from our failures, we grow from our mistakes, and we never stop trying to be better than we were." He paused and looked out at the sea of alien faces before him. "What happened at Outpost Karen was not remarkable because I am human," he said. "It was not remarkable because I am brave or special or different from any other person in this room." The chamber had grown completely silent now. Hanging on his every word, "It was remarkable only because I was there," Do-Hyun continued, "because when a child needed help, I happened to be the one standing nearby." He took a slow breath before delivering his final point. "I did not save Isara because she was Velari or because I am human," he said quietly. "I saved her because she was small and scared and alone. And I could not walk away from that." His eyes swept across the chamber, meeting the gazes of species who had been humanity's enemies, allies, and rivals over the years. "Anyone in this room should have done the same," he said. "Any being with a heart and a conscience should have stepped between that blade and that child." The Korath ambassador shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "So do not make me a symbol," Do-Hyun concluded. "Do not use my actions to prove some grand theory about humanity, but perhaps consider this." He straightened his spine and spoke with quiet conviction. "When the moment came, when there was nothing to gain and everything to lose, I chose to protect rather than to hide. And I believe that choice, that simple choice, is what defines us more than any treaty or conquest ever could." The silence stretched for several long seconds before High Matriarch Valenza rose from her seat. "The Velori delegation formally supports humanity's bid for a permanent council seat," she announced, her voice ringing through the chamber, "not because of warships or trade agreements, but because of what we have witnessed here." She gestured toward Do-Hyun with an elegant sweep of her wing. "We have watched humans for decades," she declared. "We see their wars, their flaws, their capacity for destruction. But we also see this: a species that will bleed for children not their own, and ask for nothing in return." One by one, other delegations began to rise, adding their voices to the growing chorus of support. The Korath ambassador remained seated, his expression unreadable. But even he did not speak against the tide of approval washing through the chamber. Do-Hyun stood at the podium and watched as the galaxy's perception of humanity shifted before his eyes. He had never wanted to be a hero, had never sought recognition or reward. But sometimes history chose its symbols without asking permission, and sometimes the quiet choices made in darkness had a way of shining brightest when finally brought into the light. The celebration that followed the council's decision continued late into the night, with delegates from dozens of species raising glasses and making toasts to the future of human galactic relations. Kang Do-Hyun slipped away from the festivities as soon as he could, seeking refuge in the quiet darkness of the observation deck where the stars stretched out before him like scattered diamonds on black. Velvety pressed his hand against the cold glass and stared out at the universe that suddenly felt smaller than it had just days before. The scar on his shoulder ached, as it always did when memories of Outpost Karen rose to the surface, and he rubbed it absently while trying to process everything that had happened. Footsteps approached from behind, and he knew without turning who had followed him. "You disappeared," Isara said softly, coming to stand beside him at the observation window. "The delegates are asking where you went." Do-Hyun shook his head slowly. "I was never comfortable with crowds," he admitted. And tonight there are too many people who want to shake my hand and call me a hero. Izara tilted her head, studying him with those golden eyes that still reminded him of the frightened fledgling he had held in his arms 10 years ago. Does it bother you? She asked. Being called a hero. It feels dishonest, Do-hyun replied quietly. Heroes are supposed to be brave, and I was terrified that day. More scared than I had ever been in my life. Izara was silent for a moment. Then she spoke with gentle certainty. Being brave does not mean being without fear, she said. It means acting despite the fear. Doing what must be done even when every part of you wants to run. Do-hyun turned to look at her, seeing for the first time not the child he had protected, but the woman she had become. You were 7 years old, he said. How can you remember so clearly what happened? Because you stayed, Izara replied simply. In a universe where everyone else ran, you stayed. And that is not something a child forgets. She reached into a pouch at her belt and withdrew something that caught the starlight. Shimmering with iridescent colors that shifted like living rainbows, a feather, he realized, one of her own feathers. Carefully preserved and glowing with an inner light he did not understand. Among my people, Izara explained. There is no greater gift than this. A feather given freely creates a bond stronger than blood, deeper than any oath. She held it out to him with trembling hands. You are family now. Kang Do-hyun of Earth, she said formally. Whatever you need, wherever you are, the Valori will answer. This I swear on my life and the lives of all my descendants. Do-hyun looked at the feather, then at the young woman offering it with such sincere emotion, and felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. I cannot accept this, he whispered. I did not save you for reward or recognition, which is exactly why you deserve it, Izara replied, pressing the feather into his hands. Take it, please. Let me give something back to the man who gave me everything. Do-hyun's fingers closed around the feather, and he felt warmth spreading through his chest. Warmth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the observation deck. Thank you, he said softly. And the words felt inadequate for the emotion behind them. Izara smiled. And for a moment she looked exactly like the fledgling who had finally stopped crying when he had promised to keep her safe. My mother wanted to thank you as well, she said. But she knew you would try to refuse, so she asked me to deliver a message instead. What message? Do-hyun asked. She said that when she woke up in the hospital and learned what you had done, she made a vow, Izara explained. She vowed that if she ever found you, she would make sure the galaxy knew what humanity truly was. Do-hyun closed his eyes and let out a long breath. I suppose she kept that vow, he said. She did, Izara agreed. And now humanity has a seat on the council. Not because of military might or economic power, but because of a choice you made when no one was watching. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars spin slowly past the observation window. What will you do now? Izara asked eventually. Now that the whole galaxy knows your name. Do-hyun considered the question for a long moment before answering. The same thing I have always done, he said finally. Try to help where I can, protect those who need protecting, and hope that others will do the same. Izara nodded, and her feathers rippled with approval. Then perhaps you are exactly the hero humanity needs, she said. Not a warrior or a conqueror, but someone who simply does what is right. They walked back toward the banquet hall together, and as they entered, Do-hyun noticed a group of young aliens standing near the doorway, watching him with wide eyes. A Korath child, barely old enough to walk without assistance, tugged on his parents' hand and pointed at Do-hyun with obvious excitement. Other children clustered nearby, representing half a dozen different species, all watching the human diplomat with expressions of wonder and curiosity. They had heard the story, he realized. They had heard about the human who stood against armed pirates with nothing but words and courage. And now they were seeing him with new eyes. "They are watching you," Asara whispered. The next generation, seeing for the first time what humanity can be. Do-yoon looked at those young faces, at the hope and admiration shining in their alien eyes, and understood finally why his story mattered. It was not about him. It had never been about him. It was about showing the galaxy that strength came in many forms, that power meant nothing without compassion, that the choices made when no one was watching defined a people more than all their ships and weapons combined. He had protected one child in the darkness of Outpost Karen, and now that choice echoed across the stars, inspiring others to believe that ordinary beings could do extraordinary things. The Valori feather glowed softly in his pocket, a reminder of bonds forged in blood and kept in love. Kang Do-yoon straightened his uniform, took a deep breath, and walked back into the celebration. There was still work to be done, still bridges to build, still children in the darkness who needed someone to stand between them and the blade. If he could inspire even one person to make that choice when the moment came, then perhaps being called a hero was not so dishonest after all. The stars continued their endless dance outside the observation windows, and somewhere in the vast reaches of space, the story of the human who protected a child spread from world to world, carried on whispered voices and encrypted transmissions. History would remember the day humanity took its seat on the Galactic Council. But those who truly understood would remember something more important. They would remember that it all began with a simple choice, made by a frightened man who refused to run, and a child who never forgot the hand that held hers in the darkness.